Well, welcome back to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Chupp, and before we get to our interview today, I want you to know we are very concerned at CMDA because Christians in healthcare are likely to face unprecedented challenges if the U.S. Senate allows the so-called Equality Act to be passed and handed over to President Biden for his signature. If you haven't heard about it yet, this Equality Act, which really I think should be named the Advancing Sexual Rights Act, represents a clear and present threat to your First Amendment freedoms. If it passes in the Senate, this act will be especially hazardous to your ability to contend for conscientious care of patients as a healthcare professional. This act would, among a number of things, increase discrimination against millions of Bible-believing Americans. It would deny exercise of religious freedom for Christian institutions, including Christian schools and universities. It would mandate abortion participation. It would override science and medical judgment, especially on the transgender identity issue. It would replace free speech with viewpoint coercion. And last, it would discriminate against and eliminate opportunities for girls and women, especially in sports. We desperately need God to open the eyes of our lawmakers, including the bill's very own champions, to see how unconstitutional it really is. And we are asking God to move the minds and hearts of each senator and give them courage to stand against it right now. Today, I want to urge you to join me in praying and fasting on Monday, March 29th, for the Holy Spirit to shake us and to fill us, to help us boldly speak truth on these issues. You'll be able to find a prayer guide for that day at cmda.org/Equality Act, just one word, Equality Act, and you can also easily, in less than a minute, send a pre-drafted email to your senator at freedom2care.org today. Well, if you're like me, the changes in our culture today, reflecting a rejection of the Judeo-Christian safety net, seem to have come up like a tidal wave from nowhere. As I was leaving Kenya a few years back, a medical colleague of mine asked me, "Hey, Dr. Chupp, what has happened to your great country? I don't understand how your Supreme Court decided recently to recognize same-sex marriage and so many other evil things that I have heard about in your country lately. America brought us the gospel of Christ. How can it so quickly turn its back on God?" Well, my guest today has spent the last 6 or 7 years of his life doing research for a book that was published late last year and has become an overnight bestseller. And that book is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Dr. Carl Trueman joins me and Dr. Jeff Barrows today to talk about the genealogy, if you will, of the sexual revolution, and it goes back much further than the 1960s. I invite you now to listen in to my conversation with Dr. Carl Trueman, professor of biblical studies at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. Well, I am incredibly excited to welcome to the program this week Dr. Carl Trueman. He is professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. He's an esteemed church historian and previously served as the William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and Public Life at Princeton University. He's authored and edited more than a dozen books, including The Creedal Imperative, Luther on the Christian Life, and Histories and Fallacies. He's a member of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. A couple, 3 months ago, Dr. Trueman, Dr. Jeff Barrows, who's joined me today for this program, our Senior Vice President of Bioethics and Public Policy, told me that there's this incredible new book that's come out that I need to get a hold of. I got a hold of it and showed it to a good friend of mine who's our incoming president of CMDA, and the book started flying. I have gifted this book to more people in the last 6 weeks, Dr. Trueman, than any other book in my career. So welcome to CMDA Matters, and we're so happy to have The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self available to us in 2021.
It's great to be here, and thanks very much for your kind words of encouragement and kind words of welcome.
Can you talk just a little bit about how you came to decide to write this book?
Yeah, it was a slightly odd story in some ways. As you alluded to in your introduction, I'm really a Reformation/17th century historian. Intellectual history of the Reformation, the post-Reformation is my primary field. But in my late 40s, I felt that I'd pretty much said everything of any use that I was ever going to say about that area. And there are plenty of other very talented, more talented than me, people working in that area. So I was looking for something new, and I was approached by Rod Dreher and Justin Taylor, the senior editor at Crossway Publishing, asking me if I would be willing to write a short introduction to the thought of Philip Rieff, the psychological sociologist. And I'd only barely touched on Rieff at that point. So I went away, got some Rieff books, started to read them, and realized that, yes, there was a project here, but also became convinced that a more interesting project would be applying Rieff to contemporary society. Around about the same time, the whole gay marriage thing was going down in the Supreme Court. That we had the bursting onto the scene of the transgender question in the form of Bruce, then Caitlyn Jenner. And that was raising, in my mind, a whole host of interesting cultural questions about how and why, particularly something such as transgenderism, can become plausible, not simply to academics in elite seminars at universities, but how the ordinary man and woman in the street are coming to buy into this ideology, coming to find this plausible. And so the initial project for a little book on Rieff expanded really into a major project trying to explain why the sexual revolution has taken the shape it has done, and how it has percolated down through society in a manner that affects the way that we all think. And I was privileged to be supported in this by Professor Robert George at Princeton University, who kindly granted me a year-long fellowship on his James Madison program at Princeton to work on the project. So I was able to draw on the collective wisdom of the other fellows that year in helping to shape and formulate the project.
Well, a friend of CMDA, we've heard speaking theologian Andrew Walker has done a review of your book, and he says it's the most important cultural book of the year and maybe even the decade, Dr. Trueman. When you began this year at Princeton, were you anticipating a 407-page tome that would be labeled in that way?
Absolutely not. I've been completely stunned by it. One of my favorite novels is a book called A Kestrel for a Knave by a man called Barry Hines, and he wrote this book in the 60s, and it became this stunning bestseller. And I remember seeing him interviewed, and he made some comment, and he just shook his head and said, "Who'd have thought?" And I keep thinking, who'd have thought? I had no idea that what I was writing would be found so helpful and useful by so many people. It's very gratifying. There's a sense in which I want to say, selfishly, I wrote it for my own curiosity. I'm just very glad that it's apparently proved so helpful to so many other people. And Andrew has been very kind and supportive of the work as well. So very grateful to him.
Well, Dr. Trueman, early in the book, you introduce a concept of two ways of looking at the world that I had never heard of before, and maybe in your circles it's very common, but it really struck me, and it also helped me to understand, or at least begin to understand, some of the things we're going to be talking about. And that's, I think you pronounce it mimesis and poiesis, and how it relates to the two ways to view the world. And I'd like you to kind of start this interview with kind of laying some of that foundation for our listeners that will help them kind of begin to understand what you're talking about in this book.
Yeah, the terms mimesis and poiesis, used particularly by the philosopher Charles Taylor, upon whom I draw extensively and very positively in the book, really to talk about, we might say, the way people imagine the world to be, or the way people intuitively connect to the world. And mimesis is really the idea that the world carries with it an intrinsic structure, an intrinsic authority to which we have to submit ourselves in order to flourish as human beings. And in the Middle Ages, this was relatively straightforward, because if you think, my ancestors in England in the Middle Ages were almost certainly peasant farmers. And if you're a peasant farmer in 14th century England, you have to respect the structure of the world. You have to sow your seed at a certain time in the year. You're very dependent upon the weather for the prospering, the growing of what you plant. You have to harvest it at a certain time. You have to respect the rhythm of the seasons. And the world you live in is also very fixed. You don't have the opportunity for extensive travel. So you'd be born, baptized, grow up, get married, die and be buried, probably in the same village. And this really cultivates a view of the world that sees the world as having an authority and having a structure and an order to it, to which you have to conform yourself. What we see in the modern world, as the modern world emerges really from the 16th, 17th century onwards, is a shift to what Taylor calls poiesis, in contrast to mimesis, which is the idea, if you like, that we have to learn the patterns of the world and conform ourselves to them. Poiesis is the idea that actually the world is increasingly looked upon as just raw material that we can bend to our will. And when you think about farming, in the 14th century, you could never have planted crops in the desert. But once you have the technology of irrigation, you can plant crops in the desert. Once you have fertilizers, then you're able to plant crops in soils that were previously barren. And when you think about other aspects of life, for example, industry rises. If you have a printing press, then your livelihood's not so dependent upon the rhythm of the seasons as if you are a farmer. And so what has happened with the modern world is really as technology has advanced and has given us a feeling of greater power over nature, then the idea that nature has a structure to which we need to conform ourselves has slowly but surely eroded. I won't say it's vanished completely. We're all aware that there are some aspects of nature to which we have to pay attention. We're talking in the middle of a COVID pandemic. Nature is kind of bitten back at this particular point. But on the whole, we tend to think of the world as really raw material over which we can impose our wills via technology. And that, I think, lies right at the heart of what it means to be a modern person. We intuitively think now of the world as being something that we can bend to our will, as having no intrinsic meaning, if you like, as something that we have to give meaning to through our will, through our technology. And that's a poietic view of the world, a world that rests upon a notion of poiesis, to use Taylor's term.
Well, this rise and triumph of the modern self, with the associated cultural amnesia and expressive individualism and the road, as you call it, the road to the current sexual revolution. It's about a genealogy. I think that's what Reverend Walker talked about, and I think you mentioned in your book too. It's a genealogy of this sexual revolution over the last 200 to 300 years, and a trajectory maybe in our Western culture. And you, throughout the book, talk about this, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Dr. Trueman, a social imaginary. Could you tell our listeners what that even means, and is there a way to alter this trajectory? I hope I didn't butcher the term.
No, that's correct. I have to say it's a slightly awkward term. When I first sent a draft of a chapter to a friend to review for me, and I used the term social imaginary, he said, "Do you not mean social imagination?" And no, it's actually a term that, again, Charles Taylor uses. And Taylor uses the term to get at something very important about the way we relate to the world around us. And that is that, by and large, most of how we relate to the world is intuitive. It's not that we think back to first principles. When we finish this interview today, I'm going to leave my study through the door. I cannot explain to you the atomic physics that means I can go through the door rather than through the wall. I just know that the hole in the wall is where I go through. What Taylor's getting at with this idea of social imaginary is that most of us live intuitively. Most of the way we think about the world really is the way we, if you like, instinctively imagine the world to be. And that plays big time throughout history into how people have understood themselves to be at any given point in time. To go back to my previous answer about mimesis and poiesis, we might say in the Middle Ages, the social imaginary was a mimetic one. Everybody imagined the world as being fixed and having a meaning. Today, we tend to imagine the world tilting in the other direction. Most of us have not self-consciously thought about that. It's just the way that our intuitions have been shaped by the world around us. And when you bring that down to, say, the sexual revolution, think about the broadening or the abandonment of traditional sexual morality related to the sexual revolution. Most people have not come to affirm, say, gay marriage because they've read great books arguing against traditional view of marriage that have convinced them. Most people have come to reject traditional views of marriage and to accept gay marriage because they live in a world where their intuitions have been shaped so that they want to be happy and they want other people to be happy. And everybody should be able to be happy in their own way. That's, as I say, that's not a position we've been argued to. That's a position that most of us imagine because of the way the culture has shaped our intuitions. So really Taylor's use of that term is a way of him saying, if you like, that most people's engagement with the world is not based through self-conscious theories of which they have become convinced by looking back to first principles. Most people's relationship to the world is an instinctive one that they've kind of picked up by osmosis, if you like, from the culture that surrounds them.
Well, Dr. Trueman, we have a lot of healthcare professionals who are listening right now who have a pretty good idea of what the term therapeutic means, especially in their daily professional lives. But you use the terminology of therapeutic man or psychological man, which I think you're getting from Philip Rieff, and I wanted to know how your use of those terms differ from what we as physicians consider to be therapeutic.
Yes, and that's an interesting question. And of course, I'm not although you call me Dr. Trueman, I'm really a fake doctor. I'm only a PhD, not what my father would have described as a proper doctor. He always said, he wanted a son who was a doctor, and I finally became a PhD, which was 75% acceptable to him, I think.
Well, your writing increased my vocabulary probably about 25% by reading your book. So you're a highly respected doctor here among us.
Thanks very much. The word therapeutic for Rieff really it's really to do with how one understands the self and how the self is made to fit into the world around. So Rieff would say, if you go back to the Middle Ages, go back to that fixed world we looked at in the Middle Ages, the world is fixed. And so in order to become a functioning, flourishing member of that world, you need to be taught the way the world is, and you need to be sort of trained or disciplined or educated into fitting into that world. So Rieff would say, if you look in the Middle Ages, who are the therapists in the Middle Ages? Really, they're the priests. The priests are the therapists, and what they're doing is they are preparing you for the way the world is as God's creation. They're preparing you to live in that world appropriately, and they're preparing you to die and face judgments. Those are the big issues in your life. If you jump to the 21st century, Rieff would say the notion of self has flipped. As the world, to use Taylor's terms, has moved from a strongly mimetic view of the world to a strongly poietic view of the world, so the notion of self has moved from an externally directed notion of self to an internally directed one. So where I use an example in the book of my grandfather. Say if I'd asked my grandfather, do you get job satisfaction? My grandfather was a poor working man, worked in a factory all his life on a production line. And I think he'd have said, if he even understood the question, he'd said, yeah, my job gives me satisfaction because it enables me to put bread on the table and shoes on my children's feet. In other words, the satisfaction doesn't come from the job itself. It comes from the outward direction, the responsibilities my grandfather has to the world outside himself. If you ask me that question, I'm likely to respond, yeah, I get job satisfaction. I get a real psychological buzz from standing up in front of a class and teaching kids. When I see the light bulbs going on in their minds when I've managed to explain a complicated idea in a way that they suddenly understand, I get a real buzz from that. I'm a man of the psychological therapeutic era. In other words, it's all about me. It's all about the way I feel. And Reef would say, in an age where psychology has triumphed in that way, when it's all about my inner feelings, well, who are the therapists? The therapists aren't the priests anymore. The therapists are those who make you feel good about yourself. He draws a contrast. He says, in the old days, people went to church not to be made happy, but to have their misery explained to them, to have life explained. Now we go to church to be made happy. Now I see the important people in society as those who are able to make me feel comfortable. Maybe that's a formal psychotherapist. Maybe it's a medical doctor who's able to alleviate some discomfort. Maybe it's the teacher in the class I attend who affirms me. But for Reef, therapy is now inward directed and is designed, if you like, to make society affirm the individual rather than make the individual find his or her happiness by conforming to society.
Well, there are a lot of insights in your book, how the individual feels, their identity, as well as the notion of dignity. How does a progressive secularist view of dignity now in 2021 differ from the view of our CMDA constituents who very much hold true to a biblical view of human dignity? And how is that view of dignity, Dr. Trueman, shaping the discussion surrounding sexual identity in politics today?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think what we've really seen, even in the last 20, 30 years, is a transformation in the notion of human dignity, which has come about as a result of the collapse of an understanding of human nature as something we all possess and as something which has a certain dignity or brings with it a certain intrinsic moral framework, if I could put it that way. Even the Enlightenment, I think, maintained a good notion of human dignity, by and large, I would say, on parasitic grounds. What you find in Enlightenment thinkers really up to the 19th century is a notion of human dignity built upon the idea that human beings, we all possess a certain nature that binds us together. And then if I think one way of looking at the way this has changed would be to compare, say, the civil rights as articulated by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the civil rights discourse today. My reading of Martin Luther King is he's essentially saying African Americans should be treated the same as white people because we are all human beings. And as Christians, of course, we would ground that in the idea that we are all made in the image of God. I think what we see now in a lot of civil rights discourse is every individual has the right to be treated in the way that they demand to be treated, because every individual has the right to self-determination. And that, I think, is an interesting shift. It takes you away from human nature as a universal and towards the individual or to particular groups that claim their way of articulating their identity, their way of living and being has the same legitimacy as everybody else. We have, if you like now, the individual and communities detached from any transcendence notion of what it means to be a human being. So I would say you see this probably in the medical profession, I would imagine, in this way, that I would imagine as Christian medics, you're committed to a strong pro-life ethic.
Yes, we are.
That you think a newborn child, for example, should not be euthanized because a newborn child is a person, has dignity, precisely because the child is made in the image of God. Whereas a man like Peter Singer would say, no, the child has no intrinsic dignity because that child has no conception of the future, cannot reflect on his or her own existence in any way. The only question about whether that child should continue in life or not is whether that child will bring more happiness to the parents or more sadness. We sort of do a calculation like that. So there you see, I think, where this collapse in the notion of human nature as having an intrinsic moral dignity would have immediate implications for those of you in the medical profession. And I suspect it bites most bitterly at the beginning of life and at the end of life, when the idea of what is a person becomes particularly vulnerable if you've lost the notion of human beings by possessing human nature are persons.
Well, we've run out of time today, but the really good news is Dr. Trueman is going to be joining us next week for part 2 of the discussion on his new book, released in late 2020, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Trueman.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, if after hearing Dr. Trueman today, you'd like to get your hands on his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, we can help you. I'd like to send you this book for your donation of any amount to CMDA. During the months of March and April, when you make any donation to CMDA through the link in our show notes, we will send you a copy of Carl Trueman's new book. Just go to cmda.org/riseandtriumph, one word, and click Give Now, which will facilitate your gift to CMDA, and we will send you this powerful book. This is a listeners-only perk. We sure do appreciate our listeners big time and their generous support of CMDA. The issue of sexuality as a primary fixture of identity has become such a hot-button issue in our culture. If you'd like to read more about it, the CMDA bookstore has 2 excellent resources in addition to Dr. Trueman's new book. In Love Thy Body, best-selling author Nancy Pearcey goes beyond politically correct talking points to offer a riveting expose of the dehumanizing secularist ethos that shapes critical moral and social political issues of our day. Formerly an agnostic, she makes the case that secularism denigrates the body and destroys the basis for human rights. Now, more than ever, we need to learn to love thy body. Another book, Rethinking Sexuality by Julie Slattery, challenges and equips Christians to think and act biblically and compassionately in matters of sexuality. Instead of arguing with the world about what's right and wrong about sexual choices, this practical resource equips you to share the love and grace of Jesus as you encounter the pain of sexual brokenness, your own or maybe someone else's. Both of these will be linked in the show notes, or you can get your copy by calling 888-230-2637 today. Well, our first ever CMDA Virtual National Convention under the theme, Courage Through the Crisis, Stories from the Front Lines, will be here before we know it. This event will include lectures by notable speakers as well as breakout sessions, during which you'll have the opportunity for fellowship and networking. Some of our speakers will include Dr. Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, best-selling author Philip Yancey, Dr. Alveda King, who's the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Reverend and author Burt Jones. This convention will take place April 29th through May 1st, and we will be sure to link it in the show notes today. Just go to cmda.org/events, where the National Convention and other upcoming events are posted and allow you to register today. I'm thrilled to let you know that CMDA is working on a brand new training program on how to effectively live out and share your faith in a medical or dental or PA or NP or PT or optometry or you name it, healthcare practice. After the first generation CMDA course in the mid-90s, which we called the Saline Solution, and then several years later, Grace Prescriptions, which was a DVD-based curriculum around 2014, both of these programs taught us how to interact spiritually with our patients. our new CMDA training program we are calling Faith Prescriptions. It consists of 24 videos of 15 to 20-minute duration on various practical topics, such as spiritual interventions, praying with your patients, ethical and legal implications of sharing your faith, keeping it natural, and others. Within each of these videos, we plan to include 2 or 3 shorter videos from various CMDA members across the country. So if you'd like an opportunity to be part of this new video series, we're happy to tell you how. Just email us at cda@cmda.org, and we'll send you what you need. Once more, the address for more information on how to submit your video is cda@cmda.org. You know, as much as we may think that the lack of morality and antagonism to any notion of absolute truth today is beyond anything mankind has ever seen before, just remember what Solomon wrote over 3,000 years ago in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. He said, "There is nothing new under the sun." And then several chapters later in Ecclesiastes 8:14, he says, "In this life, good people are often treated as though they were wicked, and wicked people are often treated as though they were good. This is so meaningless." Well, as Christian healthcare professionals, you care about more than bodies. You care about the minds and the souls of your patients as well. That's why it's imperative to us at CMDA that we provide you with resources that equip you to lead your patients not only onto physical healing, but also to flourish through a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. There is nothing more that matters to CMDA, and CMDA matters. That's it for this week. Please join me next week as Jeff Barrows and I continue our conversation with Dr. Carl Trueman. We'll be discussing how Sigmund Freud played a major supporting role in the sexual revolution and the eventual rise and triumph of the modern self. And he will address the question, what can followers of Christ like us do when we've been marginalized and considered as public enemy number 1? You won't want to miss it. Bye for now.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.